Hello and welcome to Eurostat's webinar series. I'm Dean Vuletic, an Information and Communication Officer in Eurostat, and I'm your moderator for today's webinar. Today we're talking about one of the hottest economic issues of recent times, consumer prices and inflation. Did you know that the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices, the HICP for short, currently covers the price changes of more than 400 products like pizza, rice, cars, and hotels? And did you know that the prices for olive oil showed the highest increase in the EU in September 2024, while the prices for liquid fuels showed the largest decrease? Consumer price indices measure changes over time in the prices of goods and services that households buy for consumption. And these indices are used for various purposes, like for conducting monetary policy and for indexing commercial contracts, wages, social protection benefits, and financial instruments. In the EU, the HICP provides a comparable measure of consumer price inflation. So in this webinar, we're going to give you insights into the HICP, including recent developments and the work carried out at Eurostat. Our experts will show you how to find relevant data and information, including by guiding you through Eurostat's food price monitoring tool. You'll be able to directly ask our experts questions after their presentations. Please send the questions to us via slido.com. The Slido code is #2447385. #2447385. You can see the link here on the screen and on the Eurostat stream page. On Slido, you'll also find a short survey to give us feedback on this webinar. Remember that this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it later on the Eurostat website. And now to our experts. We'll be hearing from Wanda Maria Guerrero, a statistical officer in Eurostat specializing in the HICP, and Svetla Pavlova, team leader for the HICP. Vanda will give you an overview of consumer prices and inflation, and Svetla will give you a live demonstration of Eurostat's food price monitoring tool. So Vanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean, and good morning to everyone. My name is Vanda. I work in Eurostat. I do methodology for the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices. Now, let's go to my presentation. There are different kinds of prices. Import prices, producer prices, export prices, wholesale prices, and consumer prices. This will be the focus of this presentation. Consumer prices are the ones at which people buy goods and services. Why do we need this? Well, consumer price indices measures the change over time of the prices. So they tell us if things are getting more expensive or cheaper. They are used for many purposes, like conducting monetary policy. That's normally the business of the central banks. Also for indexing contracts, commercial contracts, wages, social protection, and also for expressing monetary values in real terms. Now, how do we measure inflation? Normally is the annual rate of change of the indices. So it can be the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, or the Harmonized Consumer Price Index, the HICP. So, for example, in Luxembourg, in January 2023, the CPI was 160, and then in January 2024, the index, the CPI, was 120. That means the inflation in January 2024 was 3.5%. If you measure by the HICP, then it would have been 3%. Now, what's the difference between the CPI and the HICP? So within the EU, the European Union, a specific CPI has been developed, the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices. It's like the CPI, but with some more tight rules and specific rules. The word harmonized, it's very important that actually means that the EU countries agreed to compile inflation using comparable methods. And to promote and assure harmonization, we have laws and we have manuals. This is the key manual that explains mostly everything about how harmonized index of consumer prices is compiled among the EU countries. The key difference between CPI and the HICP is that the HICP takes into account everything people bought, the residents and the non-residents, like the tourists, in the country. While the CPI, it accounts with the expenditures, the things people bought, the residents, bought by residents in the country and outside the country. Also, some products may be included in the CPI, but they are not included in the HICP yet, like games of chance, owner-occupied housing, prostitution, drugs, life insurance. These might be in the CPI, but they are not in the HICP. Games of chance will be in the HICP starting from January 2026. Now, who calculates the HICP? Each country calculates its own. National statistical offices, they compile the HICP for the country, and then they send the data to Eurostat. Eurostat, with this data received from the countries, aggregates to make some regional aggregates like the Euro area aggregates and the EU aggregates. So Eurostat then publishes the inflation of the Euro area or of the European Union. Also, some special aggregates focus on specific products like energy or services or food. All this data is published in the Eurostat database. What do we need to calculate an HICP? Well, we need a lot of things. So first, we have to select products, shops, and locations. Then we collect the prices for this. We also classify the products to eco-eco, and we make an average of the prices according to their importance. Now let's go one by one, more specifically, sampling products, shops, and locations. We want the most representative. We actually have a survey that it's named the Household Budget Survey, where we ask people, what did they buy and where? So we know which are the products that people are buying more often. And those are the ones selected. Also, we know where they are buying, which are the most popular shops, and these are the shops that are sampled, and also the locations. But also, in order to be representative, we need the big shops and the small shops, we need the villages and the cities and towns. So this is an example for a black t-shirt of a certain brand in a specific shop in some predetermined location. We collect prices every month for everything, with few exceptions like education. Of course, we know that only changes once per year. So we collect the price in December 2023, the price in January 2024. We can see the inflation for this specific black t-shirt was 5.4%. Then, so how do we collect the prices? There are many ways we can collect prices, and normally countries have a mix of this. We can go to the shops with a tablet and register the prices. Or we can ask the shop to send us its database. We call it transaction data or scanner data because it's this data is collected with the barcodes. When you buy something in the shop, they scan the barcode in the cash register. So they have all the data and they can just send it to the statistical office. Normally, this is more widely used for the supermarkets. Big retail chains, they send the data automatically every month to the statistical office. We can also use administrative data. We can ask the tax office to send data on the rents, or some regulatory body on energy to send data on the electricity. Another possibility is going to a website and get the prices there. Well, they can be collected manually, or we can just web scrape. Web scrape we program a robot in R or Python, and it will take all the data in a certain website or some data in the website. When we have the prices, then we classify it to the European classification of individual consumption by purpose, the HICP. HICP has 12 divisions, main divisions, and then it is disaggregated. You can see here for clothing and footwear, it is then broken down by clothing materials, garments, garments for men, women, infants. So we have sub-indices. We can have the inflation for garments for men. And with this, we can compare the sub-indices. You can see in this graph, we have the overall HICP in red. Then we have the index for sub-indices for bicycles. The price increase of bicycles has been lower than the price increase of the overall inflation. We also have the price change for clothing with this very funny pattern because it's a seasonal product and it has a lot of discounts. We have discounts at the end of each season. So in the winter and summer, the prices of clothing are cheaper. That's why it has this very funny pattern. Then we take all these prices and we make an average according to their importance. What makes a product more important than another is how much people spend on it. These, the trends, the markets, they change, and we keep up with that. So we update these expenditures, this importance of the products, and the sample of the products and the sample of the shops every year. In December, check up all of that so that in January, the index is updated. In this bar graph, you can see the 12 divisions of the HICP and the weights for each division. That means how much people, I mean, per thousand, how much people are spending in each of these divisions. So it tells us that we spend our money mostly in food. We also spend a lot of money in housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels, and in transports. We also spend some money in restaurants and hotels. Now, specifically on big data, the HICP has been including big data. Normally, it comes from this transaction data, the scanner data, or web script data, and it can also be from administrative data sources like the tax office. So when you do these calculations with big data, it cannot be just weighted average, the same you do when you have just a couple of prices that you collected in a shop. So that means we have to use other methods, a bit more complex, like multilateral methods. So Eurostat released this guide on multilateral methods in the harmonized index of consumer prices to be used, especially in the case of big data. Now, I'll give you a bit more. Let's do a tour in our website. So this here is the dedicated section on Eurostat website for the HICP. As you can see, it's mostly about shopping. Here, if you scroll down, you have the latest news. What have we been publishing lately? Then you have the database. In the database, you can take a lot of data sets. Most important will be the index, the monthly data on the index, and the annual rate of change, which is indeed what we call inflation. Also very interesting would be the contributions, because here you can see which are the products that are causing inflation. The item weights that I show you, that tells you where are we spending our money, and the country weights, which countries contribute more for the inflation of the EU. If you want more information, we can go to publications, and then scrolling down, this is where we have the manual, the big manual that tells you almost everything about how we do inflation. You can also see other publications, like we are working on finding a methodology to include the owner-occupied housing in the HICP. And you have other practical guides, more specifically for web scraping, for example. Then you can have more information on the data we published. The indices, the special aggregates, what does it mean? How do we calculate the index? And also here in methodology, you have more recommendations on specific topics, for example, how to treat energy prices or internet purchases. And you can go here in the metadata, and if you click here, you can have more information on how each country is calculating inflation. So you can pick here your favorite country. I'm going to pick my favorite country, Portugal, and I can have more information how Statistics Portugal is compiling the HICP. I can also get more information on specific countries here in quality, because Eurostat does check if the countries are calculating inflation properly. Most of them are. We don't have big problems in that, but we do check, and then we make a report. And you can download the reports and see what are the recommendations of Eurostat for this specific country and more details on how they are doing it. Finally, laws. There are laws. The first two are the key laws on how to calculate inflation. Then we have others in more specific topics. The best part of the website is actually the visualizations. We have the price dashboard, where you can here select some of your favorite countries, and with that you could compare them in different indicators, the monthly index, the rates of change. You see here the good news in the annual rate of change, so inflation decreasing. So there are a bunch of indicators here related to prices, also house prices. And the food price monitoring tool. If you remember, in the beginning of my presentation, I referred to different kinds of prices. And this tool will allow us to compare them, compare the different types of prices. This tool is so interesting that Svetla now will show you a bit more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanda, for that very comprehensive overview. And indeed, it's now time for Svetla and a demonstration of Eurostat's food price monitoring tool. So take it away, Svetla.
Thank you, Dean, and hello, everyone. My name is Svetla Pavlova. I'm a team leader with the HICP team at Eurostat, and my job is to coordinate the production side of our work together with the methodology. So today I'm going to present to you and give you a brief introduction to the food price monitoring tool, which is a visualization tool developed by Eurostat that may provide some interesting information on food prices. The way you navigate to the tool is through the HICP section of the Eurostat website, which my colleague already showed. From the menu on the left, you can select visualizations and then food price monitoring tool, and you will be taken to this page that is shown on my screen. So from the previous presentation, you learned that price indices are calculated for many different types of prices in the economy. And this tool in particular combines several such indices to illustrate how prices are transmitted through the different sections or the different stages of the food supply chain. Here, the information provided in the tool concerns 26 different common food products, which you can find under this window here, HICP. So these include food overall, but also bread, meat, fruit, yogurt, eggs, olive oils, wines, sugar, etc. These are the products. It is available for the EU overall, all of the EU member states, as well as Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, who are part of the European Free Trade Association. And the graphs can also be viewed either as index, as is shown here, or, sorry, it's the other window, either as index or as an annual percentage change. Right. So there are 4 different indices available, which represent different stages of the food supply chain. As I said, the IPI is the import price index, which shows the price change for goods imported into the economy. It is not visible on this particular graph because it is not calculated at the aggregate level for the EU, but it is available for each country. Then the blue line shows you the ACPI, which is the Agricultural Commodity Price Index. It shows the price changes for different agricultural commodities, such as would be purchased by producers in order to make consumer goods. Then the green line here is the PPI, or the Producer Price Index. It shows the price evolution at the factory gate, so to say, or that is when a product is sold to a retailer or to a consumer by the domestic producer. And then finally, in the pink, we have the HICP, which you're familiar with. It represents the price paid by individual consumers in the store. So what the tool allows us to see is how prices change in different stages of the food supply chain, either how rapidly or by what magnitude. And it can show, for example, how prices can sometimes be transmitted through the chain with a lag. So in this graph, you see that agricultural commodity prices rise rather earlier than the other indices. And so if this price rises now, it shows up in the HICP with a couple of months of delay, only several months later. And then for policymakers, this kind of information can also be helpful to identify certain, let's say, market imbalances, or it can be used to formulate different policies. So in going back to the tools itself, it can show you the overall picture for the EU, like in this graph, but it can also be used to compare different countries. So for example, if we select a few, sorry, I need to maybe start with this here and then select a couple of different countries. So here you see the agricultural commodity price indices for food overall for France, Spain, and Hungary, and you can see the differences between the countries. The tool can also allow you to zoom in on a particular country for one or more products. So let's now do that. If we unselect two of the countries, and we can select back all of the indices, and let's say go to, let's say sugar. So we see the evolution here of the different price indices for sugar for France. And Yeah, so here you can see that the ACPI, for example, spiked first, and that only later that was translated to the producer price index. I have to say this graph might be confusing for some people because you see that the HICP is, so to say, lower than other indices, although it is at the end of the supply chain and through value added and margins, final products would normally be more expensive than commodities, but at the first glance, it doesn't look like it is what this graph shows. So it's a good time to remind you that these indices do not measure price levels, but rather they compare, meaning comparing prices to one another in absolute terms. Rather, they measure price changes. So a graph such as this merely shows that ACPI rose faster than the HICP, and maybe as well that they were more volatile. They don't show the absolute price level. So finally, I would like to draw your attention to the metadata that is associated with this tool. You can reach it by clicking on this icon over here on the side, and then you can navigate to the metadata through this link here. And what this shows you is a lot more information about the different indices than I can give in this short presentation. What could be of particular interest, for example, might be this table that shows you for the different indices what products or commodities are being used to calculate the index. So if you go, for example, to bread, you see that at the agricultural commodity level, although bread is the final product that consumers buy at the store, it is wheat and spelt that is included in the index at the agricultural commodity level. So similarly for the other products, this might be of interest. And with this, I will end my presentation and hand it over to Dean again. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Svetla, for showing us that tool, one of the many products and tools that you can access on the Eurostat website and that are not affected by inflation because they're free. The two presentations have given us many insights into the HICP, and now it's time to hear from you and to answer your questions. Remember that you can send us questions via slido.com. The code is hashtag 2447385. That's hashtag 2447385. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions now, we'll follow up and send you answers. Now, Vanda and Svetla are back to answer your questions live. So remember slido.com, hashtag 2447385. Now we're getting a lot of questions. Let me go to the first one. How is the situation with the HICP expected to evolve in the short, medium, and long term? Svetla, that's a question for you.
Thank you, Dean. Well, this is something that everyone wants to know, I imagine, and the outlook itself depends on many factors: economic, political, the interest rate set by the European Central Bank. Unfortunately, I cannot say much more than that because it is not part of Eurostat's work and mandate to do forecasting, economic analysis, and to formulate policy recommendations. This is done by bodies such as the European Central Bank and the Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs, DG ECFIN. So I would recommend to turn to them with that question. They have information on that. Eurostat is involved in producing and disseminating statistical data, as well as in formulating the methodology, elaborating the methodology that should be used for compiling different statistics. And then it is that statistical data that feed are used by the ECB or DG ECFIN to make forecasting and to formulate policy.
Thank you, Svetla, for that answer. Now, is an increase of salaries an effective measure for inflation? Vanda, could you answer that one for us?
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting question indeed. Well, not exactly. If my salary increases 10%, it doesn't mean that inflation was 10%. You obtain inflation from the prices. It's the rate of the price changes. It could be more or less than the 10%. This rate of change of the prices is, of course, used when the update in the salaries are calculated, but it's not exactly the same rate. It can be lower, it can be higher, but if salaries do not normally increase exactly the same rate as inflation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanda. Now, keep the questions coming in. Slido.com, hashtag 2447385. Now, on to our next question. This one is for Svetla. What are the factors driving inflation across Europe in recent years, and how do they vary between Eurozone and non-Eurozone countries? So, the factors driving inflation across Europe.
Thank you for this question, Dean. Well, of course, there are many factors within an economy that can drive inflation, including the prices of different commodities, the interest rates that are set, and others. But since we're talking specifically about consumer prices, I would focus on products and services. So in terms of products and services, Eurostat measures and publishes what we call contributions to inflation. And it is measured on a cumulative basis what products or what services have the highest share of the current inflation and therefore contribute the most to the current inflation. And I believe one of my colleagues will provide a link for the participants in the webinar to the specific table in the Eurostat database that shows the contributions. And I also have to add that those, for the time being, they're only done for the euro area. But you can see those by countries and also by the different product categories. So based on that information, I would say that in recent years, the highest contributions to inflation have come from energy prices primarily, but also from food. And here I would also like to add that factors may vary not only between the euro area and non-euro area countries, but they can just generally vary from country to country because different countries have, first of all, different policies. So, for example, if we stick with the example of energy, when energy prices were increasing a lot in recent years, so from the end of 2021 and then into 2022, many countries formulated some compensation measures to combat the high energy inflation. And of course, those policies varied from country to country. They were not uniform. Some prices were even capped for a period. So of course, that would produce variations in the inflation rate. And then we must also remember that the share, again, if we stay with the energy example, the share of energy in the overall basket of an economy also varies from country to country. So that produces another factor of difference. So just to conclude, I would say it's not so much the difference between non-euro area and non-euro area countries, but among different countries in general. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Svetla, for your answer. Now, Vanda, how does Eurostat make sure that inflation is calculated in the same way across all of the European Union?
Oh, that's pretty much all of our job about everything we do. So, well, we have the manuals, all the documents, the manuals, recommendations on specific topics, guidelines. Then we meet often with all the countries, with all our colleagues in the statistical offices to discuss and to agree on how to do things. And then we check. Eurostat makes these compliance monitoring visits where we check if the country is doing it right. Normally they are. There are, of course, always some room for improvement, but everybody is following the recommendations and the legislation. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much, Wanda. You certainly did. Now, one of our viewers is asking, is it possible to have negative inflation? And would that necessarily be a bad thing? So, Svetla, would you like to answer this question?
Certainly, yes. Well, in principle, it is possible to have a negative inflation rate, and it has certainly happened in the past. So this happens when you compare the indices in one period to a previous period, and the index in the more recent period is lower. So that more often happens for certain products within the classification that is published by Eurostat, rather than for the overall inflation. So I would say yes, it's possible. It has not happened very much in recent years, well, except as I said, for specific products, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, their energy prices decreased a lot, and certain services that were closed. What else could I add? Maybe just to say that negative inflation and negative figures themselves are one thing, but sometimes users think that when an inflation rate, an annual inflation measure, is just lower than the one in a previous period, that inflation is decreasing. So if you have 1% now and you had 2% at the same time last year, they think inflation is decreasing, but this only means that inflation is increasing at a slower pace. For a decrease, you do indeed need a negative figure. And whether that is not necessarily bad, well, I'm sure different people have different views on that, as well as the European Central Bank would have their own view on that. So I cannot really say for sure. It depends, of course, on the context. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Svetla. And another viewer thanks you both for your presentations and has a question for you about web scraping. So how does web scraping deal with reCAPTCHA? So when reCAPTCHA asks you to solve a puzzle to test if you're a human or a robot, how does web scraping get around that, Svetla?
Yes. Okay, I have to say we don't do web scraping directly at Eurostat, because we don't collect price data. We receive that from the member states, from EFTA countries, candidate countries, and so forth. But I know that, of course, the national statistical institutes, many of them collect prices through web scraping, and one of the ways in which that is done is that when they have websites from which they often do collect prices through web scraping, they contact them directly in order to be allowed to do that and not have to confront the capture, which cannot really be tricked. So for those collecting prices that way, using direct contact to the websites, to the retailers is recommended, as well as the use of APIs. Of course, that is probably easier to do for an official body such as the National Statistical Institute than it would be for let's say a private citizen. And I would like to add that more information on web scraping can be found in Eurostat's guide. The exact name is Practical Guidelines on Web Scraping for the HICP. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you. Now, going back to the issue of how Eurostat ensures that countries calculate inflation in the same way. Vanda, another question for you. What happens if a country does not calculate inflation correctly? What does Eurostat do? Does it notify the country? Does Eurostat amend the figures itself? What is the procedure?
Well, no, we don't amend the figures ourselves. If we, for some reason, a country is doing something not according to the regulations or not the best practices, normally, of course, we notify the country. We contact the country and we work together with the country to fix it as soon as possible. It can be that data is revised. Normally, HICP is not revised, but in case there's something wrong or the country finds out a much better data source that can give a much better, a higher quality index, it can be revised. So normally there is no legal consequences because countries in general are doing things right, and if something needs to be improved, we work with them. But in theory, this is based on regulations, so in theory, it could be that there'll be legal actions against the countries, but that never happened.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Vanda. Another one for you, Vanda. Is there an ideal inflation rate?
Well, according to ECB, yes. So there is the so-called target inflation, there is 2%. This is defined by the ECB. So I mentioned in my presentation that inflation is used for monetary policy. So monetary policy is the mandate of the central banks. So for the euro area countries, it's who's in charge of the monetary policy, it's the European central banks. Then for the other countries that are not in the euro area, it's their own central banks. So for the euro area countries, the target inflation defined by the European Central Bank is 2%. I think we're there now.
Okay, thank you, Vanda. And another question for you, actually. How did the COVID-19 pandemic affect the HICP?
Well, apparently there was not an actual impact on the figures on inflation itself, but on the way we did things, that was a bit of a nightmare. So first of all, we had many shops closed and restaurants, so it was difficult for price collection. But anyway, we have in our methodology a way to estimate prices when for some reason they're not available. So we just had more estimated prices every month than usual. Then, of course, the consumption patterns changed a lot. We used to go very much to the cinema and to the restaurants, but then during COVID, we had to stay at home and order food and order supermarket groceries. So we started updating the weights with more recent data. So every year these expenditures are updated. But normally it was with data from the past 2 years. But then because of COVID, we found a way to update it with data from the previous year. to have it, because to have this change in the consumer patterns reflected in the inflation more updated, because then we had more expenses in supermarkets than in restaurants, for example. Also in the samples, of course, we had to include the masks, the tests, and that was, well, as soon as they were made available in the market, they become very, very popular. So they were included in the samples. Because the samples are updated every year, but you can introduce a new product in any time as soon as it becomes relevant. So that was pretty much the challenge.
Thank you, Vanda. Now keep your questions coming in. Our speakers have already answered a lot of questions and they're ready to answer more. So slido.com, #2447385. Now, a question for Svetla. How often does Eurostat publish inflation figures?
Thank you for the question, Dean. Quite often, actually, HICP is the most often published statistic by Eurostat. So we publish twice a month. One is at the end of the month, the HICP flash estimate is published. This is a preliminary figure for the euro area. And then about 2 weeks later, in the middle, usually of the following month, the figures for the whole European Union are published. So that includes the euro area, the rest of the member states. We also publish figures for Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, and several of the EU candidate countries. So on average, we publish twice a month. And then there are certain figures that are updated annually. So that would be the weights. They're updated by countries in January of each year, and they're published by Eurostat then in February. And also the annual classification of the administered prices for the HICP. Those are also published annually, and the country weight, so the difference between the shares of that each country has in the overall EU basket weight. Those are also published annually.
Thank you, Svetla. And another one for you. Are rising housing prices also reflected in the HICP?
Yes, well, currently housing prices are reflected in the HICP to the extent that rents are included in the HICP, but the price of houses themselves is not yet. It's been an ongoing project of Eurostat to improve the measurement of owner-occupied housing and house prices. And the ultimate goal is for the European statistical system to eventually include that information into the HICP. But that has not happened yet. It's a rather big project where there are a number of challenges that need to be addressed before housing can fully be included into the HICP, and it has to do with how and how often different countries measure those prices, how they collect them, the length of houses, the price of houses, the price of land, and so forth. But we are moving in that direction, that it will be included in the HICP. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we're nearing the end of today's webinar on consumer prices and inflation. So here's one more chance for you to send in your questions, slido.com, hashtag 2447385. And Vanda, another question for you. Regarding the weighting, does it reflect the household consumption of the year?
Well, not of this year because we don't know the consumption of December yet. It reflects the consumption of the previous year, from January to December of 2023. Now, in January 2025, it will be updated and it will have the consumption expenditures from January 2024 to December 2024.
Great, thank you for that answer. Now, a question on recent trends in food prices. How do we explain these? A very broad question, but what sort of trends can we see?
Well, they have been increasing, and due to many factors, and also depending on the country. It's not exactly in our mandate to interpret this, but you can try to find in the contributions more details on that. So the sub-indices of food, how much did they contribute? Mostly, of course, it's logical. It's the energy prices, the transports, it increases the cost of production of food, so it increases the prices. We also had some draw problems in some countries 2 years ago, and of course, this also puts pressure on the prices. But there are so many changes, so many reasons, and it's really very country related. And it doesn't depend if the country is a Euro area country or a European Union country, like Svetla explained before. So it is a very broad question.
But well answered. Thank you for that, Vanda. Now, to Svetla. For some countries, there are no inflation figures on thermal energy in the database. So what's the reason for that?
Yes, that's true, and it varies from country to country what information is included. Although, of course, there are certain types of products and services for which we have data for all countries, but thermal energy is not one of them. So the broad reason is that countries are supposed to report indices for a certain category in the classification when their overall weight is above a threshold, and that threshold is 1 part per 1,000 from the weight of the whole basket. So when that share is smaller than 1 part per 1,000, they don't include that information in the overall HICP index.
Thank you, Svetla. Now, a question regarding taxes and inflation. How are taxes reflected in inflation?
Well, it does depend on the tax. Taxes on consumer goods, they are reflected. For example, they're included in the price. For example, the VAT, the most famous one, when you buy something, there's VAT included, and that is included in the price. And actually, if VAT increases or decreases, that will trigger normally a price decrease or a price increase. But the taxes on production, of course, those are not in the HICP. It's only taxes on products. Because we follow the prices, we try to follow the prices that consumers actually paid for, including taxes and discounts.
Thank you, Vanda. Now, I have a question about your personal experiences as Eurostat officials dealing with the HICP. When you encounter people and they learn about what you do and they talk to you about how they've experienced inflation, how it affects their lives, what do they say to you? How does inflation affect people's lives?
Well, in generally what people feel about inflation and how they perceive it is that, well, they go to a shop and things are more expensive. That's not so nice. Also in general, people have the perception that inflation is higher than what we publish because it's a weighted average and it comes with everything. So you say people, you hear people saying, "Oh, olive oil increased for the double, and inflation is only 7%." Well, but that was only olive oil. Many other things did not increase. It's good to have this kind of events. It's important that people understand a bit better, get a bit more knowledge on how it is actually done to understand that it's not just the price of olive oil that duplicates, that affects inflation, is everything else. Inflation, I think, so 3 years ago, nobody even knew what that was. It was zero inflation. Now everybody knows what inflation is, and I think they also understand a bit the link between inflation and the interest rates. And interest rates also affect people directly because of the mortgages most of us have for their housing or to buy a car and such. We also understand, and there was a question about that on the link between the inflation and the salaries. Of course, as I mentioned before, it's not a direct link. It's not like inflation is 10%, the salary increase is 10%. But when you start seeing the prices in the supermarkets increasing, you also want a salary increase somehow, more or less. So I think that's how inflation. It's important to have inflation well measured for this monetary policy and for this indexation of the contracts, the rents, the salaries, the social indicators, social pensions, social contributions. That I think it's the importance of this work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that one, Vanda. And one final question for the two of you. From a viewer interested in becoming an expert on statistics and working for Eurostat, what advice would you give to a young professional who wants to do that?
I don't know, study hard.
Now I think dive into the Eurostat website to understand better what we do, and of course apply for the jobs that are available. Eurostat is a big house; it always have some opening positions. It may be challenging, but it's worth it. It pays off.
And we have a wonderful group of colleagues from whom we can learn very, very much, as I did from the two of you today. So thank you very much for your presentations, for answering all of those questions. With that, we wrap up today's webinar on consumer prices and inflation. Thank you also to our viewers for joining us and for sending so many interesting questions. Please also participate in our feedback survey via Slido. There you can also find the address to contact our multilingual user support if you have further questions. Now, this is our last webinar for the year, so we wish you a happy holiday season and a great data-informed new year, and we look forward to seeing you again for the new webinar series of 2025. For now, it's goodbye from me, Dean Vuletic, and my colleagues from Eurostat in Luxembourg.